Well, hello and welcome YouTube, Mr. Robbins back here with yet another brand new exciting video as a part of my Solving Quadratic Equations series for the week. This is video 2 of 4, and this is really, although this is 2 and the next video is 3, I'm really going to call it a little more 2A and 2B. This one that we're doing right now is going to help build toward the next one that we're going to do in a way. This is solving using square roots, and our next video is going to be solving using completing the square. It should be pretty straightforward, but make sure you hear it out and you're making sense of things. There are some tips and tricks along the way. Make sure you check them out here. I got 6 examples for you, as well as a nice rule in order to put in play here. Here's the rule. If you can isolate the variable in a quadratic equation, see, unlike the factoring one, I couldn't get my x squared term by itself because there was a linear term as well. Not just x squared, but my squared term. But if you can isolate the variable and it's only its quadratic term, or in a squared quantity. So either if you can get this by itself like this, or if you can get it by itself like this, meaning if the x was inside, like that. This is a squared, the quadratic term, isolated, without any x's over here, or a squared quantity without any x's over here. If you can do that, then you can take the square root of both sides, and this will allow you to solve for your variable. That means if I take the square root here and here, or take the square root here and here, I'll be done with it. See, square roots are inverses of squares. Like if you have 2x equals 6, you divide both sides by 2 because division's the opposite of multiplication. Or if you have x plus 2 equals 6, you subtract 2 from both sides because subtraction is the inverse of addition. Well, square roots are the opposite of squares. It cancels out your square for you. When I take the square root of x squared, I get x. Technically, it's the absolute value of x, but I'm not going to dig too much into that. There's something we got to do alongside that notion, though. But you get x. The square is gone. The square is gone. So let's jump into these problems immediately right here. I have x squared equals 49, and you might know what the answer is. We're asking what number do you square to get 49? Now, if you remember from the last bit of problems, normally we saw more than one answer. We saw 2 answers in most problems. You can expect most of these you'll get 2 solutions as well. But there's a fly in the ointment there. We're going to see a couple that we don't. However, x squared equals 49. How do we get x by itself? You take the square root of both sides. Now, the square root of x squared is x, as I said, and the square root of 49 is 7. Now, I'll let you know right now, though, this isn't the only answer. Whenever you take the square root of both sides with a variable involved, you have to consider the fact that when you put in your number to double check your work, you will be squaring it in the end. Now, squaring a positive number gives you a positive number, but squaring a negative number also gives you a positive number too. So whenever you do the square root business, yeah, the square root of 49 is 7, but you're actually going to put a plus or minus 7 right here, or you can say x equals positive 7, x equals negative 7 like that. Doesn't matter which way you say it, plus or minus or positive or negative, it still works either way there. There's more than one answer. Let's double check that. Let me get rid of the square root there. Plug in 7. 7 squared equals 49. That checks out. What's negative 7? Quantity squared. That's also 49. That checks out. Remember, the negative value squared still gives you a positive result. So get used to this idea. And look, people are going to forget it a lot. You're going to forget it a lot. My students are going to forget it a lot. That's why you got to practice it a lot. Taking the square root of both sides with a positive result on that side will give you a positive and negative portion in there. There's a part that I'm skipping. I told you about absolute values. It's really this part in between, absolute value of x equals 7. I'm gonna wean off that really, but there is a step in between. We just don't often write it. People don't often say it though either, so there it is. All right, so we have to, here's a second example now, d squared minus 80 equals 64. I have to isolate the variable with only its quadratic term on one side. So I got to get d squared by itself. Notice no other d terms anywhere. So if I just add 80 to both sides, plus 80, I get d squared equals 144. I'm on my way to solving, just like this last problem here. So what do I do from here? I take the square root of both sides like last time before, and I'm going to get d equals, is it just 12? The square root of 144 is 12. Plus or minus 12. If you remember that, positive or negative 12. Both of them work. Remember, more than one solution. That happens quite often here. More than one solution. Again, you can just put d equals 12, negative 12 as well. D equals negative 12. Both work. Both work. Okay, the third problem here we have 6w squared equals 24. Now, I do have my variable, my quadratic term isolated sort of because there's nothing else adding or subtracting to it, but it's not fully by itself yet. See, if I take the square root of both sides, This is kind of messy. I don't want to take the square root of 6. I don't want to take the square root of 24, at least if I don't have to. Let's get the entire squared term just by itself. Let's just get it so it says w squared equals. So let's start by dividing both sides by 6. And then we get w squared equals 4. Good. Now we have it a little bit easier here. This is by itself, and I can take the square root of 4. You're not always going to be able to take the square root of every single thing that you have, but we couldn't before, and we can now, and I like those odds. So now I take the square root of w squared. That's w. Oh, I just wrote a squared again. And that equals, remember, it's going to be plus or minus 2, positive 2 or negative 2 here. Now, the square root of 4 is 2. Keep this in mind. The square root of 4 is 2. But I can square, remember what the original question was. What can I square to make 4? That's a 2 or a negative 2. Keep that in mind. All right, 3 more questions here, 3 more examples. 3t squared plus 75 equals 0. Now, it looks like I have 2 steps to do. I got to subtract that 75 over. And then just like this last one, I'm going to divide both sides by 3. 75 divided by 3 is 25, so this is going to give me negative 25 here. Okay? Now you're going to learn a little lesson here. I'm going to take the square root of both sides, but try this in your calculator maybe. Try and take the square root of negative 25 and see what happens. Most of them will give you some sort of error, likely domain error. You can't take the square root of a negative number and get a real solution, because when you square a real number, you always get a positive result, right? It's asking, what number do you square to get negative 25? It's not, there's no real number that does that. There are these things called imaginary numbers, and I'm not joking, they're called imaginary numbers. You'll learn them later in math life, and there will be answers for you. However, in this particular case, there is no real number t that's going to work for here. This is a no real solution case. It's not no solution, it's no real solution. You have 0 real solutions here, only imaginary ones. And again, I'm not making that up. I don't know why they call them imaginary. But there it is. All right, next problem here. S squared equals 0. Very basic one. Take the square root of both sides here. And the square root of 0 does exist. It's 0. But do I put plus or minus 0 here? No, there's no positive. There's no negative 0. There's also no positive 0. 0 is just neutral ground. It's not positive or negative. There's actually only one solution to this. I don't know why I saved it for this time to say this here, but there are instances now. We've seen 2 real solutions, 2 real solutions, 2 real solutions, 1 real solution, and 0 real real solutions and 1 real solution here. We've seen instances of 0, 1, and 2 now. So what gives you 0, 1, or 2 real solutions? It depends on what you're taking the square root of. If you're taking the square root of a positive number, you're going to get 2 real solutions. Notice square root of 49, square root of 144, square root of 4. If you're taking the square root of a negative number, you're going to get no real solutions. If you take the square root of 0, you're going to get 1 real solution. So that's kind of the basis behind that. If they're ever asking you when it comes to that, there are other things in play sometimes too that they get a little more confusing, but that's what I'm going to leave it to right now. All right, and the final problem to do right here, g plus 9 quantity squared equals 36. Now, for my particular students, they're using IXL to solve using square roots, and they're not going to run into problems like this, but you will when you do completing the square. So this is where it's really helpful that you learn this portion right here. And I did mention that if you have a squared quantity that's isolated, you can also take the square root of both sides. As long as the whole quantity is squared with the variable inside, that g and I kind of look the same, I can take the square root of both sides right now, and I can do what I did before. Now, the square root of something squared is just that something. It's just g plus 9. I have now effectively gotten g plus 9 by itself. And the square root of 36 is 6, but keep in mind, as we take square roots of things with variables, you're actually going to have plus or minus 6. Now, my answer's not finished. I still have to subtract 9 from both sides. And I'm actually going to put it in the front. This has to do with when we're going to do quadratic formula. You're going to see this a little more often. A number and then plus or minus another number like that. So you have 2 different answers here that we got to write in. We got to do negative 9 plus 6 and negative 9 minus 6. So g equals negative 9 plus 6. That's going to be negative 3. And then you have g equals negative 9 minus 6. And let's move my face. And we're going to get g equals negative 15. So those are the two answers there. A couple more steps involved because you have the squared quantity with something else inside that you got to then move over. All right, so that ought to do it for this one, though. This is solving using square roots. Again, get your squared term isolated, whether it's actual term or a quantity. Take the square root of it, include the plus or minus. If you're taking the square root of a negative, there's no real solution. If you're taking the square root of 0, it's just one solution, whatever it's going to be. Sometimes it's 0, but if you have a squared quantity like this, it would be different. Just figure it out. But at least that opened your eyes to a little bit of what you're going to be doing when you do completing the square in the next video. So that ought to do it for this one, guys. This is Mr. Robinson. Take care.